the government, like individual state governments, have actually screwed up rolling out their legalization plans. Like you think about, I always say it's funny, like only the government could screw up selling weed. You know what I mean? It's just like absolutely absurd. In California, it's a huge, multi-billion-dollar market.
Yeah.
But they overregulated it, they overtaxed it, and then they can't figure out why the black market is still so strong.
Oh yeah.
Again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. But politicians come in, lawmakers, and they want to tax everything and regulate everything, and it's like, gee, I wonder why people are still buying their weed on the street.
Yeah, the other day I was looking at congressional buying in pot stocks and insider buying as well in pot stocks. Posted a video about that. I had found that, throughout the industry, especially in like 2018, 2019, there were a lot of congressmen buying pot stocks. So I wanted to dive more into the industry, and that's why I'm here with Jeff Siegel today. And he was actually one of the first people in the industry and got into it, made his subscribers and his readers a good bit of money. Can you talk a little bit about that and when you first started getting into the industry?
You made a lot of money.
Yeah. What was the...
So I can tell you that the cannabis space, I've been doing this for almost 30 years now, and the most money I've ever made was on cannabis stocks.
Okay.
Canopy Growth Corporation, everyone knows, is one of the biggest players.
Yeah.
And we were in real early. Our gain was over 3,000% on that.
Jeez.
So I'm going to pat myself on the back for that one. And in full disclosure, I had no idea it would ever have launched 3,000%. Like, I figured over a course of maybe a couple years, we'd get, 100, 200%, and that would have been really great. But the timing was just perfect. Honestly, it wasn't random. I knew something was going on in Canada at the time with cannabis. So I took a trip up there, and I met with some whatever the equivalent is of congressional aides
right.
up there, and just kind of figured out what was going on before I kind of dove in. And I just, seeing what was coming down the pike, it was very obvious to me that recreational legalization was going to happen in Canada, and that was the only game in town. And everyone saw that there's going to be a lot of money to be made here. So everyone just dove into the Canadian cannabis market. And again, the timing was perfect. Where we are today is completely different than where we were. And I guess it was 2016, around that time. Obviously Canada is not the only legal market anymore, and we have so many states here in the U.S. and that have legalized. So it's a completely different world today than it was, again, like 2015, 2016.
Yeah, I think today nearly half of U.S. states have legalized recreationally, at least.
Yeah.
Were you playing options on those trades back then?
No, these were just like, these were essentially like long-term investments.
Yeah.
Again, like when I got into it, I went in with the idea that we're going to be in these stocks for a while, and over time, we'll see an increase in the gains. And it was, I think, within a 3-year time frame, we had 3 stocks that had already exceeded 1,000% gains. And when you have something go up that fast, it's gonna come crashing down. So obviously, we got the hell out. Like, we just took the money and ran. And that doesn't mean that I don't believe there's money to be made in the cannabis space. I think it's still a market that has a lot of potential. But you'll never see 1,000% gains, 3,000% gains again in the cannabis space.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like that's something that a lot of people are banking on. They want that same run again. And I think that really depends. So you don't think that even if like a safe banking act were to pass, or, what if federal legalization were to pass? And that's what everyone seems to be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that would bolster many of these stocks, but not to the point that you're going to see, a 10x return. If you were to buy today, by Curaleaf today, and then maybe next week, which is not going to happen, but next week they say,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to federally legalize. You're not going to see a massive jump, 1,000% or whatever on Curaleaf. You will see obviously a bump. But yeah, again, there was a certain enthusiasm about cannabis at the time too. It was,
Yes.
I mean, if you think about it at the time, for the first time ever, really, we said cannabis is going to be legal, and there are public companies that are going to profit from this. Now, I mean, there's never been a lack of demand for weed.
Yes.
So when it first happened, I mean, unless you are a complete moron, you say, oh, wait a minute. Finally, this stuff is going to be legal and people can buy it at a store.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge opportunity here. I mean, it's funny, though, when you think about it. If you think about the government, like individual state governments have actually screwed up rolling out their legalization plans. Like you think about, I always say it's funny, like only the government could screw up selling weed.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's just like absolutely absurd. In California, it's a huge, multi-billion-dollar market.
Yeah.
But they overregulated it, they overtaxed it, and then they can't figure out why the black market is still so strong.
Oh yeah.
Again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. But politicians come in, lawmakers, and they want to tax everything and regulate everything, and it's like, gee, I wonder why people are still buying their weed on the street. Again,
Exactly.
only the government could screw up selling weed.
Mm-hmm.
But I digress. I think I went off on a tangent there. There's nothing to do with money.
But even, and that's why I thought it was so interesting that people in Congress are still trading pot stocks, and they're still trying to get in on it as well. I found some demographics recently that only 12% of Americans consume cannabis, but that represents a $60 billion industry compared with tobacco, which is $70 billion. And I think that a lot of people are kind of conflating those two industries, and people in the tobacco industry may be looking to acquire smaller pot stocks.
Well, it's ever since I've been in the game, I mean, I've seen big tobacco execs at financing meetings.
Yeah.
They're in it already. Typically, in the shadows, it's former CEOs, former management of the tobacco companies. Of course, they're gonna get involved. They're not gonna do anything until you see federal legalization, though.
Sure, yeah. Which that still remains to be seen. We can speculate all we want about that,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it does show you something that 90% of U.S. adults believe weed should be legal, which is a huge number. And I think that if the sentiment is behind it, and politicians will eventually, they're going to want to do what their constituents want, in theory.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
Because Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, they actually legalized, and then she came back and found some way to reverse it through the court systems, and then they had another vote on it, which it failed. So yeah, theoretically,
Yeah.
you're supposed to do what your constituents want, but not always the case, unfortunately.
Do you see the industry? So I guess I was also looking at the alcohol industry, alcohol and tobacco. I know a couple years ago we had Coors trying to get into the blended drink, putting or infused drinks is what they call them.
Right.
Do you think that industry will take off or be as popular as consumables like vaping or smoking?
I don't think so. I've been hearing this claim for a long time. Infused beverages would be great. You can go to a bar and have an infused beverage.
Yeah.
A number of companies have done some really amazing work on making these things taste good and making them so it's because when they first came out, you would have these drinks, and they were essentially just sugar water with weed in it, and they tasted horrible, and you would get so amazingly high from drinking it. It was it just didn't make any sense. there's no way that was going to fly. And now you are starting to see like better, I think, recipes for the drinks. But in terms of people consuming cannabis, I mean, my personal opinion is it makes more sense to eat a gummy or smoke a joint or vape, as opposed to sitting there and paying, how much for a drink. I mean, it's not like you're going to go to a bar and they're going to offer you a THC infused drink. Maybe that'll happen one day, but I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. I think it'll be like a little bit of like a niche market. There's some people that really enjoy those. I maintain that it'll probably be a very small group of people that like the infused drinks.
Yeah. When I went to Colorado, I think around 2017, and yeah, they were selling all of those sodas and stuff. But it's almost like people are kind of turning away from soda too. And I think that if you're blending it and making it a soda, like you said, it's a very sugary drink. Mm-hmm. I think they'll just have to rethink that a little bit.
There are definitely some people that are trying to do healthier edibles. Not as many as I would have hoped for by this point. But even though I'm active in the CrossFit community, mm-hmm. and there are quite a few people I know that train really hard, but they also make their own edibles, and they make their own edibles because they don't want the sugar in it, they don't want the saturated fats and that kind of thing. So I think there is a demand for healthier edibles. I think it's going to come, but that might end up being a small niche as well.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people who are in the fitness community don't want to be smoking as well.
Right.
So I think edibles are a good kind of middle ground.
I typically smoke once a day, usually at night, a couple hours before I go to bed, just to relax me. Kind of like my dad used to have a drink, a couple hours before bed.
Yeah, sure.
And I've never had a problem. It hasn't really affected my fitness or my health. But again, I'm not like I've been consuming cannabis for more than 30 years, but I've never been a hardcore smoker. Like I don't smoke all day, mm-hmm. so I don't know how that. I don't really know how people that smoke all day are able to function, but there plenty are. I know plenty of people that do, and God bless them.
Yeah, sure. Have you ever been to? Well, I've been hearing some news, and I haven't been to Amsterdam recently, mm-hmm. but I also visited Amsterdam in the early, I think it was around 2012, and the industry there at the time was, they had the coffee shops. I know that psychedelics were still a thing, and I'm just wondering if you've heard anything about the new laws there. It seems like they're kind of turning away from the coffee shops.
Yeah, I've been watching that. I'm not sure I fully understand what's going on there. At first, I was told that they were trying to keep tourists from coming in there, and
yeah,
I don't know if like tourists were coming in and just getting really high and passing out on the street or something. I've been to Amsterdam. I've certainly like enjoyed the coffee shops, had a space cake, with the hash in it and everything. But it never. All that did was make me want to just relax, and hang out with my friends. I don't really fully understand the reasoning behind it, and it seems like a really weird timing too. Like, why would you do that now? Where it's so much. It used to be back in the day, you go to Amsterdam because you could smoke weed and not get in trouble for it, not get arrested for it.
Right.
And now there's so many places you can smoke weed and you won't be arrested. So you would think they'd want to up their game a little bit, but mm-hmm. I'm not privy to, the policy making in the Netherlands. So
yeah, I'm not. I just heard a story about it and thought that it was interesting. Maybe they're trying to recoup some, I don't know, something with taxes. Could be. I don't know.
But they have to be making money off of that.
I know, exactly.
Especially with tourists.
Maybe they want to, like you said, they don't want people coming in just for that. Maybe they want to increase tourism to, the museums and all, but it just...
You mean you can't get high and then go to the Anne Frank Museum later? I mean, come on.
The Van Gogh Museum, it's great.
Go look at some old school windmills and tulips.
when I was there, was walking down the street and because the bike culture is huge there.
Yeah.
Everyone's riding a bike, and I walked out and two bikers just collided like right in front of me. And I was like, oh my God, got to get out of here.
Why did you have to get out of there?
I didn't want to.
Were you high?
I was in a coffee shop. You know what they do in there. They're drinking coffee. So I went back and checked my brokerage account from like 2018. And I was looking at the companies that I was investing in.
Mm-hmm.
And I say investing loosely because I feel like back then it was definitely speculating. I had Altria, Kronos, NBev, IIPR, Canopy Growth. Do you remember a company, David's Tea? Do you remember when that?
I do not remember that company.
No. That was like, I think they're still around, but they, it was almost like in the .com bubble, and what's kind of happening today with VR and AR and AI. If you just add that to your name, you get a stock wrong. But David's Tea was saying that they're going to do infused beverages and stuff, and people were just playing calls on that all day. And Tilray, and then IGC, which is a company out of Bethesda. But it was just interesting to me that if you go back and look at what you were buying, probably would have done things a little differently.
Yeah.
But do you have any advice for people getting into this industry?
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, that despite the fact there was a massive implosion in the cannabis market, just so many companies went under, I think it was a good thing. There were just so many scams out there, so many companies that I remember like former mining companies would say, okay, we're going to be a pot stock now, and then we're going to buy some land and grow weed. It's obviously it doesn't work like that,
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people lost a lot of money, unfortunately. It's at the time, again, when it first started, you didn't have a lot of options. You just buy a company that was basically a producer. Again, back then there really weren't like plays on dispensaries or multi-state operators in the U.S. Now it's very difficult for a lot of these companies that are producing cannabis because it's a commodity and there's the
Mm-hmm.
race to the bottom. So it's a kind of like farming. I mean, yeah, farming is an honorable profession, but you're never gonna get rich being a farmer. I think you're at the point now where you're never going to get rich, investing in a cannabis production company. The Canopy Growth Corporations, AFRI, like all those companies, like they're going to be around. But again, it's like, you have a race to the bottom is an issue. And also just the quality of the product. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these big companies produce commodity weed. It's just, shit weed. That's what it is. And now most people, I don't think, care. I fully admit I'm kind of a weed snob. Like I'm very particular about what I smoke, but I think that's starting to change a little bit. Because there are so many options now. When you go into a dispensary, I think there are people who are starting to realize, hey, I like this weed better because it tastes better, or I have a better experience from it, or it's fresher. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I've gone to dispensaries where I open up the container and it's just dried out weed. I would never accept that from my dealer, before weed became legal. So why would I expect that from a legal operation? I don't think there are many cannabis companies now that I think there's probably a handful that are going to succeed over the long run. And those are typically the ones that have the growing operations and the dispensaries, and also are just flush with cash.
Yeah.
Because you're gonna need it. You're gonna need it. And I guess there are a few multi-state operators, some smaller ones that people ignored maybe, like Marimed is a company that I've always liked. It's a very small multi-state operator, but they have a ton of cash. They're very fiscally responsible. the revenues are constantly growing. But they were really smart in their expansion. Like some of these bigger companies, they just went out and they spent millions and millions of dollars buying everything and setting up new locations. And MariMed is like, no, we're going to stick with a couple of these states and do our own thing. And I think that has allowed them to not only survive but thrive during the implosion of the cannabis market. You mentioned IIPR too. I think that's has always been kind of a safe bet. We bought that stock shortly after it went public. It's just. It's like a hustle. It's like a rental hustle, and I don't say hustle in a bad word, but it's just, the bottom line is if you need to grow and you need indoor facilities, it's much easier to go through IIPR because they take care of everything. I think the only thing that will affect IIPR is federal legalization when the banks get involved, because IIPR has an advantage. Because they have no competition from the banks. Once the banks can get involved, the big banks can get involved and provide loans at regular rates. I think a company like IIPR may struggle a bit.
That's a really good point that I had not thought of that. People like IIPR because of the dividend payment, and like you said, because they're kind of like the landlord in the entire U.S. space. I bought that company, I think, back when it was trading at like $40.
Nice.
Sold it when it, before it really took a run. But, I definitely think that is for now, I'm looking at that, but I don't currently own any pot stocks or anything. And the industry's just been it's been, like you said, been beaten down so much lately. I've just been kind of like hands off.
Yeah. I think there are very few choices for investors that want to get into the pot stock space, because I still believe that some of them, even though some of these stocks are down, 80% from their all-time highs, I think in some situations they're still a bit pricey. Unless you can find like the MariMeds, IIPR still. I don't know if I'd run out and buy it right now, but I bought it so long ago. I just let it ride.
Yeah.
I think you're going to see too, just like there's just going to be more private cannabis companies that are they're not going to go public because there's really no advantage for them to go public. The brands are where it's at, really. If you think of maybe celebrity brands like Takao, which is Method Man's brand, they can go into various states. They decide which flower they're going to use. They partner up with somebody, and it's essentially, they go in Colorado and they sell weed with the Takao sticker on it. It's just the name, so they have very little operating costs. All they have to do is show up, approve the weed, put their name on it, and then hustle it a little bit. And that company, I think they've been around for about 3 years. They've been killing it. So a company like that's not going to go public. They don't need to, unless maybe a public company could maybe come along and buy them, which would actually be a really smart idea, because I do believe that's probably one of the few celebrity brands that does actually have any kind of credibility. A lot of the celebrity brands, and I've tried them all, and they're mostly garbage, which was kind of surprising, because you'd see Willie Nelson's brand or Snoop Dogg, and you're like, well, these got to be great, and then you try it and you're like, this is like any other crap weed, Whereas I know for a fact that Method Man actually tries all the weed first and then approves it before they sell it. And full disclosure, I do have a little equity in that company, so
okay.
It doesn't really matter because you can't buy shares of it, but I'm a big fan of how they've operated. And I think there are other brands out there that are doing the same. Trying to grow your own weed at this point is, unless that's what your business is, it's going to be very, very difficult to make a profit.
That's a good point. I think the Willie Nelson brand was one of the first ones I saw on the market.
And I love Willie Nelson. He's one of my favorite singers, and it's really, Willie, this is what you're bringing to the table? Come on.
Well, I know that his was a mixture, or at least they had a mixture of THC and CBD, which is something I wanted to ask you about as well. I know that we have there's a market for CBD, but then there's also the Delta 8 products, and people are saying that there's a loophole with Delta 8 that they're able to sell it at I don't even know where they sell it. Gas stations?
Yeah,
Can
you
you buy
can
it
get
at gas stations?
7-Elevens, gas stations.
Like Salvia or something like that. And they're going to close that loophole. So then that's going to take market share away from people who are selling Delta 8.
Mm-hmm. Delta 8 has existed solely because of the prohibition on cannabis. If cannabis was legal federally or every state had it, there would be no Delta 8. I think that any plans, I have not seen what they're going to do to close that loophole. But the problem is, you get a good chemist. All you have to do is move a few molecules around, and it's a completely different product. And that's really how Delta 8 got away with doing what they were doing, or the companies that sell Delta 8. You see the same thing in you'll see the same thing in the psychedelic space too, where you will take a molecule like maybe it could be psilocybin, but then they move the molecules around and create another substance that's different than the original psilocybin. And this can, there are chemists out there that do this all the time. Ultimately, I think there's only so much the government can do, to kind of keep the heavy hand on prohibition. And I actually think it's a good thing that they're not going to be able to stop it. Yeah, okay, we're going to get rid of Delta 8, but there's more states that are legalizing now. And the states that don't legalize, they're going to find something else. They just anytime the government can't control us, I'm all for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange to me that it's even illegal at all. It seems like something that's unconstitutional in the first place to make a plant illegal. I mean, I think that's like...
Do you know the story of how this happened?
I know a little bit, but
I'll do a quick version. Is basically after alcohol prohibition was lifted, the drug czar at the time, his name was Harry Anslinger, needed to find something else, and weed was consumed mostly by black people, Mexicans, and musicians. And he was a raging racist. Some of the things, I mean, Harry Anslinger, look up some of his quotes. I mean, he said stuff like, marijuana will make black men think they're good enough to have sex with white women. And stuff. It was like really over the top, okay? So essentially, it was a way to persecute people of color. And there's so much data on this. I mean, this is not an opinion. This is verified fact. You could look it up. And yet to this day, federally, cannabis is still illegal. It's a Schedule I drug, saying it's just as bad as heroin. Come on.
Yeah.
I mean, give me a break, So anyway, when people say that the prohibition of cannabis is rooted in racism, that's absolutely factual. And it has not ended since, I think this was, the 1930s, around that time. So what are we, almost 100 years of this? And in the scheme of things, if you look at the history of time, I mean, cannabis has been around for thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah.
If we were to look at this as a snapshot of history, it's like a blip, And I think that, future generations will look back at this time and they're just gonna be like, why did they do that? Like, how did they get away with that kind of thing? It's almost like, we look back and we're like, how was it that women weren't allowed to vote? Like, I don't get that, Like, kids are going to be like, how is it that you couldn't smoke weed?
Yeah. Everybody should be educated on the dangers of consuming certain things. I mean, that comes from parenting and school and, teachers. And, there was a lot of optimism when President Biden kind of... I'm not exactly sure, but I know that he expunged a lot of people who were in prison. He expunged their sentences, and that kind of got a lot more optimism in the industry. But of course, that doesn't actually do anything to help,
Right.
the cannabis companies. But if we could see a rescheduling, I guess that's what they call it. Take it off the Schedule 1
There,
list. But that's
there are so many bills right now being put out that there's a different ways. There's someone to reschedule. Say, well, we'll make it Schedule 3 instead of Schedule 1 so we could do more research on it, which is kind of a bullshit thing because they say, well, we need more research. There's mountains of research on this already.
yeah.
And there's this researcher, Dr. Sue Sicily out of Arizona, has been studying this with veterans for probably close to 30 years now. And I mean, her research is really some of the best out there. And she's been fighting this battle for a long time. So I think the argument that we need more studies is bogus. I think it's just a way to continue allowing prohibition to exist. The question we ask from a policy perspective is, why would anyone want to continue the prohibition of cannabis? Now, there's some people that say, well, maybe they're in bed with the pharmaceutical companies or the private prisons who benefit from the prohibition of cannabis. And there's probably some truth to that. I think there's also just like a matter of, the propaganda that was force-fed to us for so many years. And you have an older generation in Congress that kind of grew up on that and believed it. So their immediate reaction is, this is bad, we can't do this. It's so many bad things are going to happen if we legalize cannabis. So I think there's some of that. There's something to be said for that as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, just if you want to be very pragmatic about it, the pros and cons of legalizing cannabis in an individual state, what are the cons? Well, you can say that, okay, more people are going to smoke weed now, and that's a bad thing. It could, more kids are going to smoke weed. The early evidence suggests that's not true. There have been a number of studies that have shown that in states that have legalized, there's not been an increase or decrease in youth use of cannabis. Obviously, I think we need more than 5 years of data to know for certain.
Sure.
But you can't deny adults personal sovereignty. The idea that, like, I'm allowed to do what I want with my body, and the government has no business telling me what I can or can't do with my body or put in my body. And if the argument is, well, we have to save the kids, that's a bullshit argument too, because there are so many addictive products that kids consume every day. I mean, sugar is highly addictive. It's very, very unhealthy, for a number of reasons. Look at all these like caffeine drinks, energy drinks that I see kids that are in middle school drinking, not Red Bull anymore. I don't know whatever it is now that they're drinking before school.
Maybe Monster or something.
I'm like, you are 12, 13 years old. This cannot be good for your body,
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not saying that, kids should not be consuming cannabis. Again, if you look at the studies on this stuff, it's really bad for a growing brain. There's a lot of downsides to that. Just like, too much sugar, there's a lot of downsides to that too. Denying adults the ability to consume cannabis because of the concern that kids might get it, that's not how we do things, And you mentioned it too. It's like, you can always say, what's the parent's responsibility? And it's hard. It's got to be hard. I can't even imagine what it's like for single parents out there with, 3 or 4 kids trying to work, and make a living and keep them safe. But I don't believe for one second that if we were to legalize cannabis, that the world would fall apart and all these kids were going to start smoking weed. There's no evidence that suggests that at all.
No. Yeah, and the argument, if something like heroin were legal today, it's like, would you go out and do it? It's like, of course not.
That's what Ron Paul said. Did you ever see that?
That's probably where I'm getting that.
Yeah. It was great. He was just like, if we legalize heroin right now, how many people in this room would do it? Nobody raised their hand. Of course not, because you know what happens. I've always been a kind of a big drug decriminalization advocate. I actually would like to see all drugs decriminalized, because the bottom line is, if someone is addicted to heroin and you throw them in jail,
it does not help.
You're not fixing the problem. That's why I like some of these safe injection sites where people can go in. They're not going to overdose because you have people there. The supply is safe. The great thing is you also have doctors and therapists working at these facilities. So if someone says, listen, I want to get clean, they're right there. Because if you're a heroin addict and you say, I want to get clean, and there's no one right there at that time to help you, you're using again. So I think there's advantages certainly to decriminalizing all drugs as long as it's done in a responsible way. I'm not saying you should have open air drug markets and people should be, selling heroin at their local Whole Foods, but we've done far more damage to this country by criminalizing all drugs than decriminalizing all drugs. But again, looking at cannabis, I mean, it's just the fact that it's still a Schedule I drug is absolutely absurd. I would like to see it descheduled altogether. I don't think there's any reason whatsoever it should be scheduled at all. Whether or not how that's going to roll out, I don't know. I see Biden trying to make good on some of his campaign promises, but if he does decide to make an effort to fully decriminalize or legalize on a federal level, which he can't actually do without Congress, he can make adjustments, and he can hire people at the FDA and the DEA to instigate these things. But he can't just wake up one day and say, okay, we're legalizing weed. So I think, if anything, he's going to wait until the end of his term, because if he does it now, he's got enough baggage. So if he does it now, he's going to get crucified. I don't believe he wants to legalize. I think he's from the old school and thinks this is a really bad idea. Plus, his son is an addict, so I can see how he would have concerns. But yeah, I think at the end of his term, something will probably happen. And I also believe whoever runs again, this is going to be a very, very big issue, because like you pointed out those numbers before, most of the people in this country are totally fine with legalizing. And if I'm on Twitter and I make a comment about legalizing and decriminalization, there's always a bunch of people that will be like, you want to destroy our country and murder our kids and all this stuff. But those are like the loudest voices, and they're a small number of voices too. Mm-hmm. It's just they tend to be the loudest.
Yeah. So in July last year, Chuck Schumer, he introduced the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, which would decriminalize cannabis on the federal level and let states set their own laws. Obviously, that hasn't passed, but we're seeing movement, and I think it's just worth it to keep looking at the industry, look at the U.S. MSOs, the multi-state operators. There's an ETF that tracks them as well. I think it's MSOS is the ticker. That hasn't performed too well. A year ago, Canopy Growth was down 65% year to date. Aurora was down 35%. Tilray 15%. Kronos 45%. And so it's the Advisor Shares Pure Cannabis ETF is the MSOS, and that fell 52% to start this year, I guess year over year. So
I wouldn't buy a single Canadian pot still. Canada was great when it was the only game in town, but there's only so many weed smokers in Canada, and it's not like they can export it into the U.S.
Yeah.
So I mean, how much? There's only so much weed you can sell, and if most of those companies are selling shit weed, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, here in the U.S., I mean, you have like Curaleaf. I actually think that's probably one of the better stocks to own if you wanted to own a bigger MSO. And that has a lot to do with the fact that they, again, are very well funded. They have a very large footprint. And I think the cool thing about, not cool thing, but I guess smart thing about Curaleaf is while a lot of the MSOs were going into major cities to set up dispensaries, Curaleaf actually went out to some rural areas. I live in upstate New York in the middle of nowhere. Curaleaf is the only game in town. If you want to buy legally, within probably like 120 mile radius, that's the only dispensary. So
cool.
That was a really, really smart strategic move, and they've done that in a few rural areas. So I think you're going to see more of that too. You're going to see more dispensaries going into rural areas and not in the cities. I mean, I understand why that's where it started, but there's a lot of people that smoke weed in upstate New York, and they don't live anywhere near a major city.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot.
You want to go get high now? Is that what you're trying to say to me?
Is there anything that you want to tell the audience to close?
Just be really careful with the cannabis stocks. Don't get too caught up in the hype. If you see, if a bill does pass that's going to bolster the value of the U.S. cannabis market, I think you'll obviously see a short run on some of those stocks, but the fundamentals have not changed on a lot of those companies. So fundamentals will always win out over hype. Unless you know the exact date that they're going to deschedule or legalize, and you can get in right before that, I would say be very, very cautious. And know that if you're going to buy a pot stock and it's a company that you've done research on and you feel like, okay, this company has the money and has the footprint and the right management to make this a go over the long term, be patient. Know that you're going to be in this for probably, 5-10 years. It's not a get-rich. It was a get-rich quick opportunity. It is no longer a get-rich quick opportunity.
Good point. Well, Jeff, thanks for talking with me today. And from all of us here at Angel Publishing, see you guys later.